Very welcome to this book launch at the Institute for Future Studies. I'm very happy to see this book, Moral Uncertainty, out in press. I think I was there when it was, so to speak, conceived. I think I had a meeting with a young PhD student in Oxford, actually Krister's PhD student, Will MacAskill, just at the train station in Oxford when they started speaking about this. And now that was 2011 and today is 2020. So it's a book that's very well worked through and it's going to be great to hear about it. Nothing more about that. I'm going to leave to today's moderator, Hurlitz. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I am Anders Hurlitz. I'm a researcher here at the Institute for Future Studies. And I'm going to be the moderator at this book launch for the book Moral Uncertainty, written by, besides William MacAskill, who Gustav just mentioned, our own Krister Bykvist, who is soon going to appear here, and Toby Ord. And what we're going to do here today is that I'm first going to leave the floor to Krister, who's going to give an introduction of the book. This will be followed by a conversation between me, Krister, and the other authors of the book. And then we are going to have 30 minutes or so questions and answers, which will include questions from the online participants. Without further ado, Krister.
Thank you so much, and nice to be here. Thank you. As Gustav said, this took some time to finish, but it was a really delightful process involving, first of all, supervising Will, and then also with Toby reworking this into a book. So what I'm going to do now is just to give a really short, brief presentation, a thumbnail sketch, you could call it. So, moral uncertainty, what is it? Well, there are quite a few questions, I think you agree with me, are difficult, moral questions, and I've just listed a few of them here. Are we obliged to give away much of our income to help others in need, let's say 10%? How should we weigh the interest of future people against those of present people? How should we weigh animal welfare against human welfare? Even if you might think that human welfare is more important, surely animal welfare will count too, but how much exactly? For these questions, I think there are good arguments for and against quite different positions on this, right? So it seems to be reasonable to be uncertain. It's not just the fact of the matter that we are uncertain, it's also reasonable to show some uncertainty about these difficult moral questions. So the main question then of the book and this project is that given that we are morally certain, and it's reasonable to be morally uncertain, how ought we to act in light of this uncertainty? And the aims of the book is to give an up-to-date introduction to the topic. So far, there are only 2 book-length discussions actually of this kind of problem. There's Ted Lockhart's Moral Uncertainty and its Consequences of 2000, and Andrew Sappielli's PhD thesis from 2010. So this is the 3rd then book-length discussion. So it's an introduction, but it's quite opinionated, as you might have seen if you start looking into it. We take stand on quite a few issues, but we of course qualify it and say we make a first pass at solving some of the issues surrounding the topic. We have actually not claiming to have solved them completely. In some cases, we are very tentative, in fact, about exactly how to solve the problems, which means, of course, that we invite others to build on this work and do even better than we have managed. The audience, the intended audience, obviously philosophers, students and senior researchers, but also people in the social sciences that are interested in decision theory or aspects of decision theory. But importantly too, we think that the core ideas of the book are accessible to non-specialists. So I hope this introduction will convince you that that's true. The main question, as I said, is that given that we are morally uncertain, how ought we to act in light of this uncertainty? There is actually a very hard-nosed answer to this question, and it's the following. You ought to do what you ought to do, no matter whether you know what you ought to do, and that is the end of it. So some philosophers have actually argued for this kind of hard-nosed answer, and of course we can't accept it, because then it wouldn't be any book about this, right? We think we should take moral uncertainty very seriously, so we don't think the hard-nosed answer is an acceptable answer. And in the book, we go through quite a few arguments to show it's not an acceptable answer. Here, I will just touch on one particular argument, which has to do with so-called dominance cases. So this is supposed to show that it's not the end of it. There's a further question, an interesting question to ask about moral uncertainty. So what is going on here? Well, it's a situation. We have two options. You can order vegetarian food or you can order meat. And the agent is supposed to consider two moral hypotheses. The first one is that eating veg is permissible, eating meat is also permissible. The second one, eating veg is right, eating meat is wrong. So that's it. It's a very simplified sort of toy example. You can make, of course, more realistic ones, but this is just to bring out the important aspect here. Here we think it's reasonable to choose vegetarian option, since you know that you risk doing wrong if you eat meat, right? But if you actually eat veg, you don't risk doing wrong. It will be right no matter which hypothesis is true. And we think this would be reckless then, morally reckless to eat meat. And we think this is the right conclusion to draw, even if unknown to you, it happens to be the fact that it's permissible to eat meat in this particular case for some reason. So that's the idea, that this question, the answer to the question is to say that you ought to do what you ought to do, and that's it, seems to be actually unreasonable here in this particular case. And we have other arguments too. So, but what is that ought of moral uncertainty then? It can't be the first order moral ought, that the ought that provided by Kantianism and utilitarianism. What is it? So here we say that what I ought to do when I'm morally uncertain, the kind of ought we're after here is the following. What a rational and morally conscientious agent would do if they were in my situation with my limited knowledge about the moral facts. And here morally conscientious is sort of in this kind of quite thin sense, namely a moral conscientious person is someone who tries one's best to find out what's right and cares about doing right and avoiding doing wrong, prefers the doing right to doing wrong, for instance. So that's the ought of morality or moral uncertainty, and which is distinct from the first order moral ought, which utilitarianism, Kantianism, other theories will provide. And now the question is, what is our solution then? What is the solution to the question, what do you ought to do under moral uncertainty? Well, we think there are a few different answers, actually. There's not just one principle. So our approach is to divide and conquer. So we assume that there is sort of a default position, namely to maximize expected choice-worthiness. I'm going to explain it soon. When and only when, in those situations where you can actually compare the differences of choice-worthiness between moral theories or moral hypotheses. And here, degrees of choice-worthiness is just the strength of the moral reasons to choose an option. Just to give an example of what this means, look at this stylized example. Here you have two options. You can give medicine to John, who's a human, or give medicine to Jane, who's a chimpanzee. And then you consider two different moral theories or hypotheses. Peter Singer's well-known utilitarianism and so-called common sense morality. And as you know, there's a difference between them. Singer's utilitarianism is completely impartial between animals and humans, whereas common sense morality seems to give some extra weight to human welfare. And assume now that the degrees of choice-worthiness are as depicted in the diagram here. You see the numbers, they're supposed to represent the degrees of choice-worthiness. Then you can then see how you calculate the expected choice-worthiness for each option. You multiply the probability of one moral hypothesis with the choice-worthiness ascribed by that hypothesis, and add that to the probability times the choice-worthiness ascribed by the other hypothesis, right? And then you get the expected choice-worthiness.
Could I ask a question? I didn't hear. What did 50%?
Good. Yeah, so 50% here means the probability or the credence, the degree of belief you have in these two hypotheses. So that's the idea. So that's the idea, the default position, maximize expected choice worthiness. And for this to work, to be meaningful, in fact, you need to be able then to compare the choice worthiness differences between these two moral hypotheses, between Singer's utilitarianism and common sense morality. In fact, in this case, it has to make sense to say that the difference in choice worthiness between giving medicine to John and giving medicine to Jane, according to common sense morality, is in this case 4 times greater than the difference in choice worthiness between giving medicine to Jane and giving medicine to John, according to Singer's utilitarianism. So it's a comparison across theories of a difference in choice worthiness. So again, you can see that this approach then only works if you can make this kind of comparison. If it's not possible, it doesn't work. So obviously, we think there are cases where you can't make this kind of comparison. And what do you do then? Well, then we think you have to departure from the default position of maximizing expected choice worthiness. And I'm not going to get into details here. You can read more about it in the book. But the rough idea is that when you cannot compare differences in choice worthiness between theories, then try to be unbiased towards the theories. Don't give extra weight to one theory over another. Give them sort of, so to speak, equal say. And how to spell this out is a difficult matter, but we're taking inspiration from voting theory, because in voting theory, when it talks about how we should vote, usually we assume that you cannot compare the well-being or preference across people. We can't say that my desire for this candidate is stronger than your desire for another candidate. But nevertheless, we come up with principles for fair votes or fair voting principles, which is supposed to give equal say to people, despite the fact that you can't compare across people. And we're using some of these methodologies to formulate sort of an analogous principles for theories, in fact. We can talk more about that in discussion if you have questions. But that's the rough approach in cases where you cannot compare the differences in choice worthiness. There are some other things going on in the book, and just to mention a few other highlights before I finish here. We have a new account of intertheoretical comparisons of choice worthiness, which I might come back to in the discussion time. We show some implications for meta-ethics, the field in philosophy where you discuss, have questions about morality. For instance, you ask the question, what is it to make a moral judgment? Is it to express a belief? Is it to express a desire? And the difficulties we are identifying are difficulties for one particular meta-ethical position, namely non-cognitivism, the idea that moral judgments are expressing, in fact, desires and not beliefs. So we're showing that this idea about moral uncertainty is difficult to take into account if you are a non-cognitivist. Difficult, perhaps not impossible, but difficult. We also show some implications for practical ethics, for instance, abortion, vegetarianism, but even population ethics and other issues in practical ethics. We show also that there are no sort of straightforward implications, which sometimes has been argued, for instance, about abortion, that you don't have to actually do serious thinking about principles about abortion. You can just do this moral uncertainty stuff. We show that that's too simple a view. And finally, we discuss the value of new moral information, the value of sitting down and thinking through what's right and wrong and taking seriously this kind of moral uncertainty. And we show that in some quite important situations, we should, in fact, think more about what matters most rather than act right away, right now, and save lives. Right now, it might be better to actually wait, think through the value of life, and then be able to actually, in that case, increase value in a more serious way. So these are other sort of highlights of the book, which also we're happy to come back to in the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Krister. So, before starting the conversation, maybe we should let Will and Toby introduce themselves to the participants here. So, can we start with you, Will? Can you give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. So, I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University. I did my DPhil at Oxford under the supervision of Krister. And as well as moral uncertainty, I also work on issues related to effective altruism and to what I call long-termism, the view that we should take the interests of future generations seriously and try and make sure the world goes well for centuries or millennia to come.
Great. Thank you. Great to have you here. Toby, can you say a couple of words about yourself?
Sure. I'm Toby Ord. I'm also at Oxford at the Future of Humanity is on existential risk. Seriously about the long-term future of humanity and the threats that may threaten all future generations. Actually, there's 2 books came out in the last few months for me on these topics, and I'm thrilled to be able to share all of these things with everyone.
Thank you. Great to have you here. You broke up a little bit, but I think you were about to say, or what you said, but we didn't really hear, was that you were affiliated to the Future of Humanities Institute.
That is right.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So to start the conversation, I've prepared a couple of questions for you, and I thought maybe we can start with a question to you, Will, and then Toby and Krister can chime in after we hear what you have to say first. So what are, in your opinion, the main practical implications of moral uncertainty, and in particular of your proposal to how to approach moral uncertainty?
Sure. So as Krister hinted, I think any implications you draw, of course, are going to just be dependent on what credences you actually have in different moral views. So you can't escape doing the first order moral philosophy of arguing about which views are most plausible. But I think, at least in my own case, there have been a few kind of broad stylized implications. So one is if you look at the kind of big debate between consequentialism and non-consequentialism, there's 2 ways in which consequentialism departs from non-consequentialist thought, where non-consequentialism thinks that there are some things you ought not to do, even if that would bring about a better outcome. And it also thinks that there are some things you're permitted to do, even though that would not bring about the best outcome. So in the former case, they might think you shouldn't kill 1 person to save 5. In the latter case, they might think it's okay for you to keep money and spend it on luxury items for yourself, even if that could do more good by, say, being focused on global health and development in poor countries. And I think in this case, broadly speaking, consequentialism and non-consequentialism get kind of one point each under moral uncertainty, where it's plausible to me that the side constraints that non-consequentialism invokes involve higher stake situations than is true for the consequentialist. So perhaps under moral uncertainty, you'll be more likely to refrain from violating someone's rights, perhaps killing 1 to save a greater number, than you would if you were just very confident in the consequentialist view, perhaps. On the other hand, the issues where you're wondering, should I use some of my income to try and make the world a better place, perhaps by helping the very poor? Well, consequentialism, or most normal consequentialist views, would say you're obligated to do that. It's very important that you do. Whereas non-consequentialist views would not say that you have strong reasons against doing so. So again, under moral uncertainty, it seems like you have what is appropriate to do is to follow the more consequentialist recommendation of using your money to make the world a better place. The second category of things where I think there are broad implications of taking moral uncertainty seriously is expanding our circle of moral concern, where, at least on common sense ethics, animals get far less weight than humans do. But there are some arguments that we should give them quite significant moral weight. Under moral uncertainty, I think we should start to take that more seriously. And given how many animals there are in the world, how many animals are affected by humans, 60 billion alone on farms every year, that really becomes quite significant. Even more important, again, I think, is thoughts of future people, including people who may or may not exist, just potential people. where there are very plausibly hundreds of trillions, perhaps very many more people to come. And so you might feel unsure, well, how much do their interests really matter? But again, under moral uncertainty, I think there are good arguments for thinking that their interests do matter. But under moral uncertainty, you should place some significant weight on their interests. And then given just how many people there are to come in expectation, we should take issues that affect the long-term future very seriously indeed. And then the final set of implications, I think, concerns, again, something Krister hinted at, which is the importance of doing further moral research and moral exploration, where if you're making high-stakes decisions, well, the potential gains in choice worthiness that you can get from doing a bit more study or reflection in order to improve your state of knowledge and understanding about moral matters is very great indeed. And in fact, that's also true for the world as a whole. If we can make the long-run future go slightly better by just being a little bit closer to the correct moral views, that can be enormously important indeed. And for a related reason, I think it's important not for society to keep its options open for as long as possible. So I just discuss this in the context of human extinction in other work, where even if you think, oh well, maybe it's actually for the best for environmentalist reasons or some other reason, for if it were the case that humanity were to go extinct, that would seem very bad from the perspective of option value, because we shouldn't be confident in that at all. If we go extinct, then we can never come back from that. Whereas if we continue and engage in further moral reflection, moral research, then we can make a more informed decision about what to do with the future of society in perhaps several centuries' time. So that's a very kind of high-level view. Obviously, once you start to dig into the details, things get complicated. That's broadly what I'd say.
Very interesting. So, Toby and Krister, do you have anything you want to add to this? Maybe Toby first.
I think that's a fantastic overview. And I have a very similar approach to it, to Will. And it really does shape how I think as well about a lot of these issues.
Okay. Krister, do you want to add something to?
Yes, perhaps. So I've been continuing the work on evaluative uncertainty, actually, more specifically the value of population change. And it's part of the big interdisciplinary climate ethics project here at the Institute. And what's striking there, of course, there are these urgent questions now about which measures to choose when it comes to climate change. And we know that the measures will affect future generations quite radically and in different ways. And in order then to decide, it looks like we have to know how to value population change. We need to know how to value quality and quantity and how to weigh them against each other. Should we make sure we have more people with a lower quality or fewer people with a higher quality, for instance? And what's striking then with this approach about taking into account moral uncertainty, or more specifically evaluative uncertainty, is that you don't have to make up your mind before you act. So the idea is there is something reasonable to do, even though it's unresolved, actually, how to value quality and quantity, for instance. And it's unresolved about how to value additional lives. There still is room for rational and reasonable action, which I think is good news, because we need to act now, and we can't always wait for the philosophers to decide and think through these things and come to an agreement and come to the truth and then apply it, please. That's not how it works.
Yeah, indeed. And this is a nice bridge to my second comment, actually, which I'm going to direct to you, Toby. So after spending so much time thinking about moral uncertainty, has this in some way changed the way that you think about or approach the subject matter of ethics itself?
Yes, quite a lot, actually. I used to think that I had a moral view. When people are saying a Kantian would think this or a utilitarian would think that. But now, after having thought about this moral uncertainty a lot, I realize that I really, I'm not a utilitarian or a Kantian. I'm someone who takes a lot of different theories seriously, and I have a distribution of credences across these different theories, across all the different theories I find plausible. Obviously, some I find more credible than others. And even just doing that is somewhat liberating. Because rather than getting into this situation where you feel you need to defend your favorite theory against all comers, and try to always argue that it's right, or that if someone points out a counterexample, to feel like you're defensive or on the back foot, instead, the very fact that you're not ascribing 100% credence to anything means you're already aware that you have doubts about it, and that you're interested in finding out, making a more accurate set of credence.
Toby's breaking up a little bit.
Okay,
sorry,
Toby.
Sorry. You broke up a bit. Could you go back maybe and repeat what you said in the last 30 seconds? Or
Sure, I'll try. Maybe I should be brief so that if I've just got a bad connection here. But yeah, I find that it's liberating in having this approach where you focus on how much credence you have in the different theories, because you feel less argumentative and more like you're trying to find the truth. And so if someone comes to you and they have a view of ethics that you think you're very unlikely to eventually adopt, normally you would just pretty much ignore it because there's almost no chance it would become your preferred theory. But from a moral uncertainty perspective, you're interested in what it has to say and in how much credence you should give it and in what domain of things it's got a unique view. And then maybe in situations where that domain comes up, you'll think that actually it does win the day. And on many approaches to moral uncertainty, the balance that you have between the theories shifts according to the situation. So you might be in a situation where one theory that you have less credence in thinks it's a really high stakes situation. And in those cases, you may be more likely to act according to it in those cases. And then finally, there's this interest where you can think of what you've got as an effective theory. The way that you act according to different situations is a little bit like a mixture of all the theories in which you have credence, where you give weight to all the types of considerations that they give weight to. You had a lot of credence in utilitarianism, but also some credence in egalitarianism. Even though utilitarianism gives no weight to equality, you would find that your judgments would give it some weight, less than a pure egalitarian theory, but more than you would otherwise have. And in general, the effective theory you've got ends up being quite pluralistic, involving lots of different things that are plausibly sources of moral value, without having the commitments to all of these different things simultaneously. You instead have credence in a whole lot of fairly pure theories, but then your kind of overall effective theory is quite complex and actually able to deal with many situations.
Thank you. So can I ask Will, are you agreeing with Toby as much on these points as he was agreeing with you?
Yeah, I'd say I was. And I believe it was actually me who first mentioned to Toby this dislike of saying, well, I'm a utilitarian or I'm a consequentialist when we take moral uncertainty seriously, because the thing that's really important is what we do under moral uncertainty. And another change, I mean, maybe one other change in how I think about things is I feel like I'm able to have credence in more simple views that perhaps sometimes have unintuitive consequences, because their moral philosophy, if you're trying to get kind of all the intuitions right, you end up with some very complex theory that doesn't have much theoretical appeal, but kind of gets the right answers. But often you can still be getting the right answers in terms of what you want to do by making a decision under moral uncertainty if you just have belief in different moral views that have much kind of nicer theoretical properties. And you don't always follow them. Sometimes you follow one, sometimes you follow another, depending on the circumstance. But often that leads you closer to common sense intuition and allows you to kind of have the best of both worlds of kind of mainly subscribing in terms of your degrees of belief to views that have these nice, attractive theoretical properties, while still not making, when you're taking moral uncertainty seriously, making recommendations that might seem very extreme or unintuitive in particular cases.
I see. And Krister, do you share their attitude?
Yes, I would like to add something though, because as we've been pointing out before, this is not telling people not to do traditional normative ethics. It's still very important that they try to explore various principles and theories and make the best of it, so to speak. In fact, again, in the project here in climate ethics, we have explicitly told people to work on particular solutions to the paradoxes of population ethics. There are quite a few, as Gustav Arrhenius is one of the leading paradox makers. And there are really difficult questions, and there are people going for different kinds of ways out, right? But it's difficult to decide which way out is the best, right? But if you go for this kind of approach, you don't have to decide that. You can let these people, and some of them are, I guess, fanatists about their way out, right? Let them be that. Because they're going to develop the best version of that particular way out, or that particular principle, or rejection of other principles. And then you can look at that. Okay, thank you for the best version of that way out and that way out. And then you can make up your credences on the basis of that kind of work, groundwork, which has been done by yourself sometimes, by other people. So it's sort of a collaboration, in fact, where you can sometimes take the perspective of an Kantian or utilitarian or what have you, for the purpose of developing the best version of that theory, and then standing back and think about, how plausible is this theory compared to other theories when it comes to the decision-making phase.
Interesting. So another question: so if one follows the proposal that you forward here, something which you were hinting at in your presentation as well, it seems that we are engaging in a venture that requires us to make some kind of comparisons across different value dimensions or across different moral theories. So for instance, how can we compare the badness of lying according to Kantian theories with the badness of a life year lost according to or due to premature death according to the best version of the utilitarian theory, let's say? So could you say a bit more about that perhaps?
I could, and it could take me an hour,
okay.
But I will be short. No, so that's, of course, the crucial problem for this kind of approach, where you say that, as you said, we have a default principle which requires us to make comparisons of differences in choice-worthiness across theories, not just within, but across theories. And how do you do that? In fact, you can take a step back and ask, how do you at all make comparison of any kind between the values from different theories? So let me start with that question. I think that's sort of a part of a more general phenomenon. So quite often we sort of make value comparisons across so-called locations. So take time, for instance, right? So I can say I'm better now than I used to be, right? I hope. And of course, what I'm saying there is not that there's a time at which I'm better than myself. That's ridiculous, silly. What I'm saying is that the value I had at a certain earlier time and the value I had then is less than the value I have now, or the value I have now is greater than the value I used to have, right, as a moral being, perhaps if it's moral value. So you can compare them across times, apparently. But you can continue, you can think about someone looking at me, or I thought you were better than you are, right? Again, that doesn't mean that they are thinking that I'm better than myself. That's a ridiculous thought. I hope they don't think that. Rather, they have describing me a value which is greater than my actual value, right? So it's a comparison of values between the mind of someone and the real world, so to speak, where I am with my actual value. And so that's a sort of a mind-world comparison. But we can also have mind comparisons, right? So you might think that, let's say, pleasure is sensory pleasure is bad because you're ascetic, right? You really sort of don't think it's good sensory pleasure. Perhaps intellectual pleasure is good, but sensory pleasure is bad. And I think it's sensory pleasure is good, right? So here we would say, how would we describe the case? Well, we would say that the value you ascribe to pleasure is less than the value I ascribe to pleasure, or vice versa. The value I ascribe to pleasure is greater than the value you ascribe to pleasure. And of course, we can also present this in counterfactual terms. We can say, if you were right, then the value of pleasure would be less than it would be if I was right? Because I assign it, say it's good, and you say it's bad, right? And there I think you can take a clue to actually understanding inter-theoretic comparisons of value, right? Because you can replace Anders here with a theory, some kind of aesthetic theory, right? And you can replace Krister with hedonism, right? And then you can see, well, hedonism says that sensory pleasure is good. Asceticism, if we call it that, says that sensory pleasure is bad. And then we can describe the counterfactual test there too, right? In this case, would say, well, if asceticism were true, then the value of pleasure would be less than it would be if hedonism were true, right? And there you have it. There you have a cross-theory comparison of value. And so I think the sort of deep radical skepticism about not being able to make any comparisons across theories, that's not a viable position. Now, of course, what I showed you now was just the comparisons of levels of value, right? And in fact, to maximize expected choice-worthiness, you need more. You need to also compare the differences of choice-worthiness. So, of course, much more needs to be said, but then I need another half an hour to get into that. But I just wanted to give you the background, and some of these arguments are actually mentioned in the book. I've developed a little bit further. So I think when it comes to then the initial question, which about Kantianism and utilitarianism, that depends, the answer is, right? Because if Kantianism and utilitarianism happens to use the same kind of value concept, let's say choice-worthiness, if it's the same kind of badness concept, right, then I think what I just said would be applicable, right? Because you're talking about the same kind of value. If it's not, if it's radically different concepts of value, perhaps in the Kantian sense, it's worth, right? And in the utilitarian sense, impartial value of states of affairs. They seem to be quite different, right? Because worth is, it's about actions or people, and the impartial value of states of affairs is about states of affairs, a quite different kind of value. And there, my approach, which I just went through, doesn't apply, right? What do you do then? Well, if our theory would be just the default principle, we would be stuck, right? Hopeless. We can't say anything. But of course, we do have another part of the theory, namely that in cases where you can't make these comparisons, there's still something you can do, namely you can be impartial towards the theories. You can give them so-called equal say, and there we use these principles inspired from voting theory to develop these principles, so you can actually get a result out of it as well, in this case when you can't make comparisons. So again, to repeat, if it's the same kind of concept, choice-worthiness concept, then my previous remarks will be applicable. If it's not, if it's radically different, then the second part of a theory will kick in. I should say finally, though, that I'm now actually developing a further thought, or it might be a further thought, I'm not sure. Namely, perhaps we sometimes can make cross-categorical comparisons. We actually are comparing across different kinds of concepts and categories. And to give you just one example, I think I can say that this table is a better table than Trump is a president. I can show you that it's stable, right?
It stands up.
Stands up at least, yes. Right, and people right away saying, yeah, that makes sense, right? It's true, I guess people will say, in this room at least. Right, and you wonder what this is a value. This is a chair value or table, table value, and the other one is a presidential value. How can you compare, right? But somehow we can. So what I'm trying to do now is to develop a theory about how that's possible. And just to give you a sense of what's going on, if you simplify enormously and think about the Kantian theory using a particular kind of concept, let's say worth, right? There might be still an ordering, right, from the top to the bottom. Let's say it's very simple that way. And let's say that some action happens to be at the bottom. It's really, really Kantian bad, right? And then you compare to the impartial value ordering for the utilitarian, and you have a top, let's say a limit, so you have a heavenly option, right?
Yeah.
And then you think, and they, the utilitarian, think the same option has that heavenly impartial value. Then it looks like we can make a cross-categorical comparison, namely saying that the value, this ascribed by the utilitarian is greater than the value the Kantian is ascribing to the same option, even though the value concepts are actually very different in this case, because you're looking at these two rankings, so to speak, and one is bottom ranked in the Kantian ranking and one is top ranked in the utilitarian ranking. So that's just one case, and of course it has to be expanded, it has to be applied to cases where you don't have this sort of top and bottom, right? For instance, I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, very interesting. Do you feel that you want to add something to this, Toby? Or are you convinced that Krister is right, that we can compare this table here to Donald Trump?
Maybe that one is going too far. I'm not sure. I agree that it seems like you can intuitively make sense of it. It seems like you can intuitively make sense of that. I'm not 100% sure whether we can, but it's you're right that maybe it's just that our standards are lower with a kind of speech act like that than they should be when trying to sort out the fundamental fabric of how we should think about morality.
Will, do you want to chime anything on this, or otherwise I think we should open for general questions. But let's see if Will wants to correct his supervisor.
But I will add, just on this question of how to make intertheoretic comparisons, there's really two projects to address. One is the formal project of how can we even make sense of the idea of making such a comparison? And then there's a practical project of, okay, well, you give me two theories. How should I actually compare those two? And one thing we argue for in the book is the possibility of amplified theories, where that's two theories that are identical in the way that they would order different states of affairs or rank different actions, but where one regards everything as being twice as important as the other theory does. And this might seem strange, but we give a number of arguments for it. And to see just one example of this, let's just say, consider the consequentialist view that values both human welfare and animal welfare, that values humans 100 times as much as animals. And then consider a second view that regards human welfare and animal welfare as being of equal importance. What we argue is that there are two ways of understanding this. One is where the view says human and animal welfare is of equal importance because animals are much more important than you thought. They're as important as humans, as you on this other view, as important as human welfare is. On the second way of understanding it, it's that human welfare is less important than you thought. It's nearly as important as you, on this first view, thought that animal welfare is. And we give a few reasons for thinking why that might be the case. So it might be the case that the kind of metaphysical basis for value is different in these two cases. Perhaps on the first view, if you kill a human, you're doing two bad things, reducing the world of well-being and violating the rights of a certain sort of individual, and perhaps you can extend that to all creatures. Similarly, you might be able to make sense of this with appeal to the idea of fitting attitudes. So perhaps if you move from the view where humans are more important to animals and then realize that humans are less important than you thought, that might be fitting to be disappointed if you do that. But then if you have that view that for any theory, there's a kind of, in fact, what we normally call a theory is an infinite family of theories that have higher or lower stakes. Then the question of, in practice, how do you compare across two different moral views becomes quite similar to the just question of first order moral philosophy. Which of these many different views is more plausible or less? It might well be the case that you think, well, if it's the case that animals and humans have the same level of welfare, that's because we've neglected the importance of animal welfare, and animals are just much more important than we previously thought. In which case, you'd be inclined to have the moral view where humans and animals both count equally, agree on the value of humans and human welfare. It's just that they disagree on the value given to non-human animal welfare, which is how I would be inclined to do the comparison. So I can leave that there.
Yeah, thanks. So now I think it's time to open for questions both from online and from in this room. So to our online participants, I remind you again that you can write questions in the Slido link that you can see on the webpage where you're watching the seminar. And to participants here, if you can raise your hand, I'll hand out the word. But we can start with Folke.
Yeah, I just saw that somebody was going to ask about possible regress, and I would be interested to hear about that. But I have another question. And so you said that you're arguing in the book that it might be difficult for a non-cognitive reason to accommodate moral uncertainty, perhaps in general or just your approach to it? I don't know. I mean, my question, because that made me wonder, are you pursuing this discussion under a set of meta-ethical assumptions? I mean, when you gave your introduction, you talked about the hypothesis being true and reason suggests that, and so on. So I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, so now the idea is rather that the non-cognitivist will have a problem making sense of degrees of moral judgment. And that, of course, we assume or we argue, in fact, for that possibility, that your moral judgments or your moral beliefs, as we call them, can come in degrees in the same way as empirical beliefs or beliefs about fact of the matter. And what's problematic for the non-cognitivist is, as I said before, they identify moral judgments with some desire-like state of mind, and take the very simple version, which is too simple, but just to sort of focus on something. Take the view that to judge something right is to desire it. Now, if you want to make room for degrees of confidence in this judgment, and also make room for degrees of the importance you ascribe to the action, you have a problem for this simple non-cognitivism. Because if you look at it, it's one mental state that can vary in one dimension. It can be stronger and weaker desire, right? And that's it. But we know that when it comes to moral beliefs or judgments, they can vary in two dimensions. You can be not especially confident that something has great importance, or you can be very confident that something has very little importance. So importance and credence, degrees of belief in judgment, in moral judgment, can actually vary independently as well. But if you look at this theory I just gave you, moral judgments are desires. They can vary in one dimension only, and then you can't capture this, right? Kind of two independently varying dimensions, importance and degrees of confidence. So So that's the challenge. And then we go through various sort of approaches or solutions to that, and we criticize those solutions. About the question whether we take a stand on metaethics. Well, we do suggest that you do have a problem if you're not a cognitivist, right? Because that's basically the conclusions of that chapter, that having gone through these sort of solutions, having found really difficulties, big flaws with them actually, and sometimes big problems, perhaps can be overcome, but it's unclear how you do it. That gives you an indirect argument for cognitivism. Having said that, you might say, well, as a non-cognitivist, I'm not interested in degrees of belief. I'm not in, of course, we don't believe in beliefs. I'm not interested in talking about truth. That used to be a view among these kind of non-cognitivists, but that's not the common view anymore. So nowadays, non-cognitivists or expressivists, I guess, more properly described, are sort of quasi-realists. So they want to actually make sense of realist-sounding language in morality. We talk about it's definitely true that torturing babies for fun is good and right. We say it's a fact of the matter that this is so. And we talk about degrees of confidence, obviously, and also knowledge. We say, I really know it's wrong to torture people for fun. So what quasi-realists are doing is trying to make sense of this kind of language, even though they're not really realists. That's why they have the quasi there, preface. Qualifying it. So that's a real challenge for the modern non-cognitivists to actually make sense of this realist-sounding language, which includes talking about degrees of moral belief.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I had a much simpler
Okay,
wording, really. So I totally, I mean, your argument that you kind of indicated here obviously deserves scrutiny and so on. But I was just wondering, if you know, at the beginning of the book say, you know, we are cognitivists and you need to be that, or because I can imagine that it would be fun for you to rather say that we want to be as make our proposals about how to act under uncertainty as little sensitive as possible to controversial assumptions in metaethics. And is that the...
Yeah, so we're not making taking a stand in the beginning of the book, and we do think that, you know, perhaps there is actually a reply to our objections to the non-cognitivists, right? So they can make sense of degrees of moral belief and the rest of their realist-sounding language. Then they're perfectly fine. They can perfectly, you know, they can talk about moral uncertainty and accept our theories. But so far, we haven't seen any good accounts. I mean, they might still be there, as you said, and we don't have knockdown arguments, obviously. No.
Thank you.
You have, yeah, of course.
You can see this is related to the Frege problem. This question for non-realists or non-cognitivists, that if I give a logical argument in terms of moral propositions, so if I say all animals have a right not to be killed, this chimpanzee is an animal, therefore it has a right not to be killed. They may have a challenge if they understand those propositions not as things that are true or false, or sorry, those things that I'm calling propositions, not as things that are true or false, but rather as just statements of expression of an attitude, such as hooray to preserving the rights of animals and so forth. Then there's this challenge about why do these things that are not propositions obey the propositional logic or appear to? And quasi-realists attempt to give a theory that answers that, whereas some other people might say, you know, just bite the bullet on it. And similarly, there's a question about why is it that if these things are not actually truth-apt, they're not things that could be true or false, these moral claims, why is it that they seem to obey the axioms of probability theory, like credences do? So that's another kind of version of this kind of challenge to treat this somewhat more tentatively as a moral datum that beliefs about moral propositions or, you know, seem to behave like this. That's one way to run with this, at least. I think that's like what Krister was saying.
Okay, could I then ask, I mean, of course there are familiar ways or attempts have been made by non-cognitivists to the Frege problem, like Alan Gibbard and so on. Do you engage with those at all, or no?
No, and I think there's no.
No, you don't have to. I'm just
No. So I think there's a slight difference though between the sort of problem we are identifying, namely that it's the attitude you are in when you make a moral judgment, and the fact that this attitude has two features, namely that you ascribe importance to something and it comes in degrees, right? So it's not just about language here, it's actually about a psychological state which seems to have two independently varying dimensions, and we need to make sense of that, right? So of course obviously there are quasi-realist accounts of moral fact talk, right? You can talk that way. What you're doing is saying it's a fact that's wrong to lie. You're just endorsing it, or you're sort of stomping, so to speak, linguistically, or just stressing the fact that you and expressing a stronger emotion or something like that. But you can always sort of make up an expressive story about what you're doing when you make that statement. But actually, this challenge about credence for moral judgments, it's about the psychological state and try to make sense of that it has these two independently varying dimensions, and not just about language. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we should probably let in some questions from our online participants. So we have my assistant Tim here who's going to read out questions.
Okay, so we do have some questions from the online audience. First question is from Ole Hagström, and he says, we could be uncertain about how to handle moral uncertainty. Does this lead to an infinite regress?
I think I'm supposed to answer that, unfortunately. So that's a really good question, and of course it's difficult to give a really good answer. What we do discuss though in the book is that to be in regress in the sense of there's no stopping point seems not to be true for normal human agents. There is a level, there's a limit when it comes to psychology, so to speak, how high up in your uncertainty you can get. Of course, for any such level, you could have been at a higher level. And for that level, you could have been at a slightly higher level. But it's not true that you could be at all these uncertain at all these levels to infinity, so to speak. That's not psychologically possible for human agents. So that's the cheap answer to this question, that no, it doesn't lead to an infinite regress because we are not agents that can actually deal with it, go through all these levels of uncertainty, and therefore it's not a problem. But of course, it's cheap and it's not actually taking into account the seriousness of the objection. So it's still true, of course, that you can be uncertain about the approach we are taking to moral uncertainty, right? And we might think there is a better approach. And what you do about that uncertainty, we don't actually talk about much about that. We give some suggestions in the very first chapter, how you could do sort of a ladder of various principles kicking in at different levels of uncertainty. But that's sketch, and we also acknowledge that it has to be much more discussed. We also refer to the debate because there are actually more substantive accounts out there how to treat and how to deal with this kind of regress. I should also say finally that the regress, of course, will be an issue for any kind of uncertainty, not just moral uncertainty. You can have rational uncertainty. You can have uncertainty about rationality principles, like dominance principles or expected utility principle, and so on. And there you have exactly the same structural problem. If you want to take that kind of uncertainty seriously, you move up to other level, and so on. So you then have to think about these different levels. Or take epistemic uncertainty. You are uncertain about epistemic principles, what you do. And the question is then at the second level, when you're uncertain about the principles that are supposed to deal with first order epistemic uncertainty, what you do. So this is a general problem across all normative domains. And it needs to have, I think, actually in that case, a general answer, actually. It shouldn't just be a specific one for moral uncertainty, another one for epistemic, a third for prudential, and so on. It should be a solution that applies to all. But we don't provide a good solution.
Okay.
That's the honest answer.
Maybe take another question from...
Keep going. So we have another question from Joe Roussos, and he says, on credences and theories, what if I think all moral theories are false? For example, because I think they're more like models, useful but approximate, idealized, etc.
Who wants to
Who
pick
wants
up
to?
on?
I can say a bit on that.
Mm.
So one can apply, and in fact, we primarily apply moral uncertainty at the level of entire theories, where you could imagine these fully blown moral theories and then uncertainty between them. Maybe if you're willing to allow for sufficiently fine-grained moral theories, such that there are perhaps infinitely many such theories, maybe a very high order of infinity, depending on how you set it up, then maybe you're willing to kind of grant that one of those is true. It's not that there's just absolutely no possible way of having a theory, but you could still run into trouble if you're trying to apply this in a situation where you have to entertain so many things and do infinite integrals instead of sums and so on. So that's one aspect. But another aspect is that you can often apply these principles at a level that's like parts of theories. For example, you could say, suppose you're facing a trolley problem. You could say that you're not sure whether killing is as bad or worse as letting die. Or how much worse is it? It's another way to put it. Is it to kill someone than to let someone die? And at that point, you don't have to get into questions about exactly what it is about those people's lives that adds moral value to the universe, or exactly why it is that killing, what are the units of killing versus letting die. You might be able to actually just restrict to this kind of like this moral proposition about the case at hand, as opposed to understanding the fully blown theory of morality. So that might be a way that you could take this forward using some of these principles, even if you have skepticism that there is any such true theory.
Interesting. Do you have anything you want to add to this, Will, or is this roughly how you see it?
You said you kind of believe that all moral theories are false, but it's natural to ask the question, well, how confident are you in that belief? So perhaps it sounds kind of maybe like a meta-ethical belief that you have. And through accounting, I think you should seem overconfident, be certain in that belief. And if not certain, then you should be factoring in the proportion of your credence that is assigned to the idea that moral theories are actually true. And that could have significant impacts on what you think you ought to do under moral uncertainty.
Do you want to add something, or should we?
Yes, perhaps. So I guess it's about the function of, or the role of modeling in sort of normative ethics. Because one role, of course, is to think about very simplified sort of situations and ask yourself what is right or wrong and good or bad in those very simplified situations, whether you have sort of stripped away a lot of realistic features that would make things very complex and so on. And then, of course, you make judgment about that situation, right? And those judgments can be right or wrong, true or false, about this hypothetical situation. But if you want to use the model and apply it, so to speak, and be guided by it here in this world, which is very complex, then, of course, you have the general problem of translating conclusions from the modeling to the reality, right? And, of course, there are issues about that, and there are solutions to that, and lots of thought being gone into that. And here I think we can just piggyback on the best versions of that kind of problem, which is a general problem for actually modeling in science too, because obviously you do modeling in science and then you apply it somehow to engineering and concrete sort of policy making sometimes even. And the question is, how can you do that? And then and we're happy to accept the best version of that kind of sort of problem. Yeah.
Okay. So then we have another question from in-house, Anandi. I don't know if you can borrow Tim's microphone, maybe.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about whether your view of sort of what to do in the face of what you might call first-order uncertainty applies to higher order uncertainty that might result from disagreement between two agents who accept your theory. So I'm thinking many of the practical questions we face require collective action or agreement between people about what to do in that situation. And if there's moral uncertainty and you have two agents who approach that with different prior credences in the relevant moral theories, so one person who's, has a high credence in utilitarianism and low in Kantianism, and the other who's the reverse, does your theory have something to say about how they might come to an agreement from those two perspectives?
Can I just start off? I mean, I think we do say very little about actually what kind of credence you should have in a moral theory, right? We suggest a few things, but we don't have a theory about that. That goes beyond the scope of the book. And of course, also, we don't have a theory about how to aggregate credence from different people, which is also important, of course, when it comes to policy making and when you have experts disagreeing and giving different credences. So both those things are not the focus of the book. So we sort of assume there are these credences which might have gone through some very nice aggregation procedure and also have been sort of filtered through some kind of epistemic constraints and so on. So they're actually not just wild and so on, but actually sort of based on some evidence at least. And then aggregated if there are sort of these expert disagreements. So we're at that stage where we got that. But of course, you're right, in order for this to be sort of fully applicable, you also have to have ideas about how you get those credences, right? And we haven't provided that. But of course, there's a lot of research out there about how to do that.
Okay.
Did you want to add anything? Toby, you want to add something here?
Great question. And I think that there's several different very similar sounding things that are all coming up here that one needs to tease apart. So one of them is that there's a question of a kind of political pluralism or something. How are we all to get on with each other in a world where there is this moral disagreement? Like, what are the right ways to, for society to proceed? And maybe if we're claiming, well, actually, I'll get the different versions first. That's one. Then there's a kind of a particular theory that is a pluralistic moral theory that you might have credence in. So a first order theory that has, gives a lot of weight or elements to things that you might think of as from very different ethical traditions or very different kinds of values. Then there's moral uncertainty, where you have like one person has credence in a range of different moral theories. And so it's unclear exactly which of these should be doing the work here or what exactly the question is. So if it's one approach would be to invoke questions about peer disagreement. If these two people do think that they're each other's epistemic peers, then maybe they should, on hearing that the other person has seen very similar evidence to them and is equally competent judge, but has come to this different conclusion, maybe they should each kind of change their credences to have quite a bit more weight in the other person's theory. And maybe that would actually reach the same distribution after doing that. If so, then that's a very epistemic approach to dealing with the situation. Whereas a slightly different question could be, what should a social decision maker do if the constituents of their country or their group have this different range of beliefs? And it might be the case that we often assume that it's kind of not possible to aggregate these kinds of moral preferences between different groups when they're doing that. Sometimes we do something like majority rule. And majority rule corresponds to a particular form of answer to moral uncertainty, which is my favorite theory. And various other answers, like first past the post, if no theory commands a majority, that one is like my favorite theory. But there are also other different approaches that correspond to other different answers to the same question. So I think there's a lot of tight interrelation here. I don't have a perfect answer to it, but it's intriguing that if an individual, or perhaps all of the individuals, have the same kind of ways that they trade off value between these different theories. So if they all endorse the same kind of intertheoretic comparison between two theories, then maybe that intertheoretic comparison can be used by the social planner in trying to work out how to weigh together these different beliefs that people have.
You want to add something as well, Will, or?
No, I think that covers it really well.
Okay.
I guess the only thing, maybe the only thing I'll add is that, we just mentioned disagreement briefly in the context of why we ought to have quite a reasonable moral uncertainty, namely that ethics is hard and there's so many people that disagree with us, and that gives us a reason for not being very, very confident in one particular moral view.
I think we had, Gustav, you had a question, or was that a follow-up to this question?
No, it was a question, a new question.
Yeah, but we can take your question.
Oh, okay. So one gets the impression from this discussion that you take expected choice-worthiness as your basic. And I wonder if you could explain why you're doing that. Why we couldn't be, for example, risk-averse, or we might think that some kind of probability should be ignored, or like same problems that arise when we talk about the empirical case.
Shall I start? And so as we say in the footnote, we are happy to bring in risk weights, right? So we're not sort of set on this particular kind of shape. So we can make it more complicated by having risk weights, in fact. And what I think more general approach is just that we are sort of piggybacking on the best approach to empirical uncertainty when they're uncertain about facts, and where you have well-defined differences of utility, let's say. What's the best approach to that? And we are happy to then take that approach and apply it to moral uncertainty. And that also would make it sort of more plausible, I think, that, you know, we take something that sort of seems to be very sensible and has been tried and so on and developed and so on, and then apply it to moral uncertainty. We have then some sort of backing from its success in a different field. But so we're not actually strictly saying no risk weights, nothing like that. We are actually open to that. But yeah, that was just an introduction. Perhaps you have more things to add. Toby or Will?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, to the extent to which there are theoretical problems or theoretical baggage with approaches to descriptive uncertainty, other than maximize expected value, those would be inherited here. So issues to do with Dutch books and so forth. If you have a particular answer to dealing with this that doesn't involve those problems, say, and that's how you deal with descriptive uncertainty. At least I personally would endorse using the same approach to risk for descriptive cases as normative cases. As it happens, I go with the maximize expected value in the descriptive case, so also in the normative case. If you have different approaches, that might be possible, but it's also the kind of thing that's going to start to trip you up a bit. It's going to create a whole lot of additional problems for you to do with what order are you understanding things in your argument. You know, maybe if you're taking one form of expectation over another form of expectation, you know, they might not commute. There could be additional challenges. And there are also cases where, at least at first glance, we're not even sure what form of uncertainty we've got. So for example, suppose you believe, you're pretty sure that we should respect the rights of persons. And there's a chimpanzee and a question about doing a particular form of experiment on it, but you're not sure whether this chimpanzee is a person. If I flesh that argument out and give credences on these things and so on, you might feel like you can say something about it, even though I haven't exactly kind of specified whether being a person is a moral concept or is a form of descriptive concept about theory of mind or something like that, and also about the brain states that chimpanzees have, which we don't fully understand yet. And so it's certainly convenient if your theory doesn't mind what form of uncertainty is going on at which step in the argument. And that seems kind of intuitive. If you did have a different approach, you would have to be very clear on what form of personhood we're talking about in this argument and so forth. That's not to say you can't do it, but that it introduces more wrinkles. Oh, and a final point is that I said that I want to avoid the theoretical defects of Dutch books and so forth. One thing I didn't mention earlier when I talked about all of the theoretical virtues of having a moral uncertainty approach, or at least maybe the practical virtues that you kind of gain, where, as Will put it, and he indeed was the person who first spoke to me about how useful this is as a way of seeing the world, that that if you have some weight in theories that have different properties, then your kind of effective theory inherits kind of watered down versions of those properties. But that's also true with defects. So if you have some credence in theories that where some options are incomparable with each other instead of better or worse, then generally your effective theory inherits incomparability. If you have credence in theories that have cycles where A is better than B is better than C is better than A, your effective theory might inherit these cycles. And also this, so on for kind of susceptibility to Dutch books and so forth. So unfortunately, I probably do have some credence in theories that do have some of these theoretical defects. And then this might kind of infect my overall apparatus. And then there's something a little bit odd about me telling you that I don't want to take a particular approach to uncertainty because I would have to take on these defects. Maybe it's not so bad having the defects only in virtue of the fact that I have a clean theoretical system that has some credence in theories with defects. Maybe that's a less bad sense of having these defects, but I do have them now. So there's an interesting angle there too.
Could I just press them a little bit on this issue? Because you say it's, you're moving from the best theory, but isn't it a bit more problematic for you? Because you're supposed to be kind of agnostic between different competing moral theories. But some people say that the approach you do when you kind of weigh together these theories is more consequentialism in style, with this maximizing expected value thing. And that is kind of slanted or biased toward that kind of thinking. And actually, I don't see any reason for why you couldn't be a satisficer, for example, in this respect.
So my view on this, which might be different to my co-authors, is that it's not that it's consequentialism at this higher level, and it's not. It's in fact, it's what it has credences over and not consequences in this case. It's not assigning value to consequences and maximizing it. It's assigning values to choices and maximizing it.
But similar analogies. We
at least a little bit
aggregationist who don't like aggregation. How are they going to like this?
Well, the way I think of it is that these properties of maximizing expected value kind of thing, or choice worthiness in this case, what's going on here is it's not that it's copying that from a kind of consequentialist framework. It's rather it's copying it from a decision theoretic framework. And so it's because I think that that's the correct way to make rational choices, or the correct theory of rationality, that I think it's also the correct theory to be applying at this higher level. If you disagree on rationality and you think that that's not the right way to be rational, the right way to be rational is something that's kind of less mathematical, and then I guess I would say you probably want to take that theory up at this higher level. At least that would be a more consistent way of kind of this reflective equilibrium between your decision theory, your moral views, and your moral uncertainty views.
Mm-hmm. Or if you're uncertain about your theory of rationality.
I'll add to that.
I wanted to. Yeah, maybe we should.
Be completely certain in a non-consequentialist moral view, and then the output of our theory would be entirely non-consequentialist, or completely certain of, a disjunction of several different non-consequentialist views. So it's certainly not slanted towards non-consequentialism in that sense. And indeed, you might think it's slanted because only consequentialist views, or at least have cardinal ranking, a kind of cardinal choice worthiness function can give you degrees of wrongness, and something like Kant's ethics just says this thing is wrong and this is somewhat less wrong, but there's no meaningful quantity there. But part of the work that we do in the book is precisely to show how we can extend decision-making under moral uncertainty to cases where all you've got is a ranking of options in terms of their choice worthiness without any degrees of choice worthiness, which is certainly one way of accommodating what might more often be non-consequentialist theories.
Okay. So, yes, another question from online participants.
We have some more questions from the online audience. This next question is from Derek Parfit. And the question is, how will this help solve the paradoxes of population ethics?
Anyone of you feel particularly suited to answer this question? Will?
So I do think that there is a fairly precise implication that it has. At least, well, I'll kind of explain. So let's divide up views of population ethics into two categories. The first is the kind of the separable views. So that's where you can assess how good the future is without having to pay any attention to what the rest of the world is like, to agents who are kind of in the distant past or on the other side of the universe or something like that. So one of these is the total view, where you just add up the sum total of well-being across all people. The second is a critical level view, where you every person makes the world better as long as they're above a critical level, as long as their life is good enough. So it's like you take the sum total of well-being across all people, but minus some fixed amount for each person. And now, if you're just unsure between those different views, then you will act under moral uncertainty like you endorse a critical level view, but just with a critical level that's somewhat below the critical level. On those critical level views, you have some credence in, but above the level of the total view, where the critical level is 0. Mm-hmm. The next stage is then to think about these views that are non-separable, where that's, for example, average utilitarianism that cares about the average well-being across all space and time. And those views, extremely implausibly in my view, think it really does matter what happens what has happened to individuals in the distant past or to individuals in other areas of the universe, because that affects how high is average well-being, and is it therefore bringing up the average or bringing down the average to bring into existence someone at a certain level of well-being. But suppose you do give them some credence. Well, if you believe at least that the universe is very big, so there's just lots and lots and lots of life in the universe, then when you add one extra person, when you make a small change to that very large number of people, those views act like critical level views again. It's just that the critical level, again, let's just go with average utilitarianism, that critical level is set at the average. And so it seems, now there's obviously this hard question of kind of what's the average well-being of everyone in the universe? That's a tough question to answer. But at least from the theoretical perspective, it seems that when we're then aggregating our uncertainty over these separable views and these non-separable views, we're going to be led to something like a critical level utilitarian view. And so where that critical level is very hard to answer, but at least formally it seems like we end up with a fairly robust answer.
You can see some of this in a paper I wrote with Hilary Graves called Moral Uncertainty About Population Axiology. So if you Google that, it makes about half of the type of argument that Will was raising there. Will, do you know if the second half is in print somewhere?
Yes. So if you go onto the Global Priorities Institute, then there's a paper then co-authored by Terry Thomas and Christian Tarsney called, I think it's Non-Additive Axiologies in Large Worlds, if I've got that right. And that makes the argument specifically about the fact that these non-separable views act like critical level views if the background population is very large. And then putting that all together was just now. And
to be a bit more clear about this, what we're saying is not that we've resolved the paradoxes of population ethics, but rather that in the limit of questions about making big changes to the world, such as avoiding existential risk and thus allowing humanity to survive for many, many more centuries than otherwise would. In questions like about big changes to the world, or if the world is just big in general, if there are many conscious observers in the universe, or humanity's had a very long past, or we count other animals as well, and we realize that there have been, probably millions of trillions of moral agents have already existed. If you've got either of those situations, they tend to make a pull towards the critical level views, including total utilitarianism.
Thanks. I think we have time for one last question from the online audience, if the authors can be brief in the response.
Okay, so there's one more comment, or one more question here. It was the top-rated question. So it says, regarding maximize expected choice-worthiness, why should we consider the choice-worthiness according to each theory rather than the desirability/utility to an agent if that theory were true?
Who has the quick answer?
I guess I'm not completely sure what the question is about. So it's true that we have an agent there, and the agent is interested in choice-worthiness. We assume that because that was part of the definition of morally conscientious person, right? And it cares about choice-worthiness and prefers more to less choice-worthy options, but also cares about the differences, if it's meaningful to talk about differences in choice-worthiness. And that utility of the agent will then mirror the structure of the choice-worthiness. So in fact, a morally conscientious agent will have a utility function that mirrors the sort of choice-worthiness function and then act accordingly. Of course, you might not be a morally conscientious person, but then the idea is that it would be what you ought to do still, even though you're not that kind of person. Given the definition of what the ought of moral uncertainty, it's what the conscientious and rational person would do, right? But if you are morally conscientious, then your utility function will actually track the choice-worthiness function, even across theories.
Okay. So maybe we should let that be the last comment from the authors. But before we thank them, I think I forgot to say that the book is not only available for purchase from Oxford University Press, but also open access published on Oxford University Press's webpage, and easy to find if you just Google and
just download for free.
Yes, download for free.
Yep.
And enjoy.
But you can also buy it.
Yes, you can also buy it.
And it's nice, beautiful piece of art.
Yes, and analyze the imagery. Yes. So with that, thank you to Krister, Toby, and Will.
Thank you
and
for really good questions.
And thank you to the online participants as well.
Thank you.